Okay, today we're going to dive into one of the most infamous and, frankly, disturbing criminal cases in Australian history. We're talking about the Snowtown murders. It's a really chilling story about manipulation, control, and unbelievable brutality that ended up staining the name of a quiet little town forever.
So between 1992 and 1999, mostly in and around Adelaide in South Australia, a group of men, all led by this one charismatic psychopath, carried out this series of absolutely brutal killings. And the media gave it a name that, well, it sticks with you: the Bodies in Barrels murders.
12. That's the final number. By the time this whole nightmare was over, 12 people had lost their lives. Just let that sink in for a second.
Right, so how did this all come to light? Well, the case completely broke open on May 20th, 1999. Police were looking into a missing persons case, and the trail led them to this abandoned bank in the tiny town of Snowtown. And what they found inside, it was truly the stuff of nightmares.
You know, the full horror of it all was revealed piece by gruesome piece. Inside that old bank vault, they found 6 large plastic barrels. And inside those barrels were the remains of 8 victims. That one horrifying discovery then pointed investigators to a house back in Adelaide, where they found 2 more bodies buried in the backyard. The whole twisted web was finally starting to unravel.
So, who was behind all of this? This wasn't the work of just one person. It was a small, tightly knit group, and they were all pulled into this violent world created and orchestrated by one man. So let's take a look at exactly who they were.
Okay, so you've got 4 central names in this whole case. At the very top, you have John Bunting. He was the ringleader, the mastermind. Then you have Robert Wagner, who is his key accomplice, kind of the muscle of the operation. Then there's James Vlasakis, who got drawn into their circle and would eventually become the star witness against them. And finally, you have Mark Hayden, whose main role was helping to dispose of the bodies.
At the absolute center of this whole twisted web was John Bunting. By all accounts, he was charismatic, incredibly manipulative, and just fueled by this intense hatred for people he decided were undesirable. He had this weirdly magnetic personality that just drew people into his incredibly dark and violent worldview. Bunting's warped ideology was really the engine for all these crimes. He saw himself as a vigilante. He even kept what he called a rock spider wall. Rock spider is Australian slang for a pedophile, and it was this chart of potential targets. But let's be clear, this wasn't vigilantism. It was about pure psychopathic control. The torture was all about dominance. He would even force his victims to call him God or Master right before he killed them.
And if you want to try and get inside their headspace, just listen to what Robert Wagner, Bunting's number 2, actually said in the courtroom during his sentencing. It gives you a really chilling look at how they justified these horrific actions to themselves. But here's the thing, the victims weren't just random strangers that they picked off the street. The way these killers operated was way more personal and, honestly, a whole lot more treacherous.
This is what makes this case so deeply, profoundly disturbing. Most of the victims were people from inside the killer's own social circle. They were friends, they were roommates, and in the case of James Vlasakis, they were his own half-brother and his stepbrother. I mean, we're talking about the ultimate betrayal of trust here.
And they had a system, a really cruel, calculated 4-step process. First, they'd target someone vulnerable. They'd befriend them and then isolate them. Then they would torture them to get their bank details, PIN numbers, that kind of thing. A particularly cruel step was forcing the victims to record these audio messages, basically explaining why they were disappearing, which would create a cover story. And finally, they would murder the person and then steal their identity to collect their welfare payments.
All up, they managed to steal more than 97,000 Australian dollars from their victims' accounts. But investigators are really clear on this. The money was just a bonus. It wasn't the main motive. The real driver here was Bunting's psychopathic need for violence and control.
And the lie at the very heart of their whole justification becomes so obvious when you actually look at who the victims were. Yeah, they claimed they were vigilantes going after pedophiles, but the reality? Their victims included their own friends, family members, people with intellectual disabilities, and even their former romantic partners. Basically anyone Bunting decided was weak or had just become inconvenient.
And in a final, just unbelievable act of horror, the last victim, a man named David Johnson, was lured to the Snowtown bank. And he was murdered right there, in the vault, surrounded by the barrels that held the remains of the other victims. And then, in an act of just ultimate depravity, Bunting and Wagner fried and ate a piece of his flesh.
So that discovery back in 1999 kicked off one of the longest and most complex trials in the history of South Australia. And the aftermath of this case, well,
It continues to be felt even today. The trial for the main two, Bunting and Wagner, took almost a full year. They were finally found guilty in late 2003. Now, decades later, the case is actually back in the news because two of the other perpetrators, Mark Hayden and James Vlasakis, who cooperated with the police, have recently been granted parole.
So when the dust finally settled in the courtroom, here's how it all shook out. The ringleaders, John Bunting and Robert Wagner, they will die in prison. They each got multiple life sentences with no chance of parole, ever. For their cooperation, Vlasakis and Hayden received lesser sentences, though still very significant ones.
And what about the town of Snowtown itself? Well, in this really cruel twist of fate, even though only one of the murders actually happened there, and neither the killers nor the victims were even from the town, its name became completely, irrevocably linked to these horrific crimes.
For decades now, the town has had to live with this really difficult legacy. On one hand, it's faced this huge public stigma. But on the other, it's also seen a weird rise in what's called dark tourism. You know, people visiting just to see the infamous bank. And all the while, the community has been fighting to redefine its own identity and escape the shadow of these crimes.
So it leaves you with this really heavy question, right? And it's not just for the town of Snowtown, but for any place that's been touched by this kind of profound tragedy. How do you move forward? How does a community possibly reclaim its own story and escape its darkest chapter? It's a question that really doesn't have an easy answer.